and hilarious for others, talk on what now passes for the gold standard. Shekhar.
Thank you, Abhijit. So 10 minutes, I guess? Yeah. So when you follow Angus, even if you didn't really agree with him, his powers of persuasion are so vast that one inevitably is turned to his point of view, and I've seen this happen again and again. As it so happens, I myself subscribe to almost everything that Angus has put forward. This is born both of a long life in the World Bank and also in more recent times a concern with producing evidence that actually influences policy. So I'm going to agree with him largely, and I guess the big question for us, and I hope then to be short so that we can have really a discussion with this very large and engaged, I hope engaged audience. Since I agree with a lot, I'm just going to extend his argument out a little bit and then end quickly so that we can actually have a discussion with Angus and amongst all of us. First, of course, Angus needs to come here more often so that he can actually push this point of view about why evaluation is really terribly important and there is really no gold standard. In fact, it almost kind of goes against the whole grain of evaluation if you pick on something and say this, once it has this chapa on it or this brand on it, passes without much muster. So I think that this is a very important point. You've all heard the strengths of RCT work, the minimal assumptions involved, the fact that there is an absence of bias just in the way the experiment is set up, and of course you get to examine causality in ways in which it usually isn't possible in real life to do so. I think there's a broader turn in the profession and in thinking about monitoring and evaluation that's come about as a result of the emphasis on trials and experiments, and that really goes to the kind of assumption of flying by the seat of your pants that very often, and certainly having seen it from inside in the World Bank, but it's just not the World Bank, it's the Planning Commission, it's all over the world where policymakers think they're doing the right thing, they're well-intentioned, and lo and behold, you have a policy or a program. And we see a lot of that currently happening in India as well. So I think this thirst for knowledge, this understanding of what goes into good evidence and then good policy is something that I certainly think the kind of move towards trials and randomized trials has brought about. And I think that's a major factor. But when I think back about some of the key pieces of work that have been done in India in the last 2 decades that have significantly changed our view of what works or what doesn't, what should be happening, what creates accountability, what doesn't. And if I just were to focus on perhaps education or health, I see Jean-Rez here. Many of you would know the probe report that he and his team did in the late 90s, which really gave, for the first time, shape to public opinion about what's right about primary education and what's not working about primary education. Certainly didn't have any trials in there. The work that I myself was associated with for the World Development Report on service delivery, focusing on absenteeism in schools, and what caused absenteeism, the fact that it was an easy statistic to measure, the fact that it actually could be comparable across different districts, different regions, different countries, helped greatly to think about what's wrong with our public schools. And again, no randomized trials there. The most prominent example of this kind of evaluation that has shaped a lot of thinking in public life, in civil society and in the government, is the work of Pratham and the work on ASAD, the annual survey of education that they do, which again doesn't have a evaluation, a randomized controlled trial, but when you see a girl child who should be in 6th grade not being able to read a simple card and trying to turn it round and round to be able to figure out which way it reads, you know something is seriously wrong. And so again, here's another example which has moved policy and moved thinkers where we don't have randomized trials. And then of course, the report on the ICDS by Focus in the mid-2000s, again, is an example of that kind of work. And all of this goes to show that really, in some ways, despite the large number of PhD dissertations that have come out using randomized trials, we seem to be actually getting much more impact out of the kind of trial and error method, the kind of work that was embodied in the reports that I cited that seem to have had a much bigger impact. So that's just by way of example. And actually also see Bharat Ramaswamy here. He did a very nice paper on looking at the leakages out of PDS, comparing the Indian PDS with the Philippines program that is similar. Again, no RCTs there, but really a great deal of careful work that suggested what's wrong with our food distribution and our food security system in both countries. Let me just point to some of the larger issues that I think are happening as a result of accepting something as a gold standard, something that by its very nature is not bearing as much scrutiny as everything else. And I think one factor here is crowding out. I think in the we are seeing instances where researchers are turning down opportunities to evaluate public programs when randomization is not feasible. I think that's a very strong knock-on effect of this focus on a implicit acceptance of the RCT approach. Doctoral students are searching for something to randomize. That's again, I think, a very bad effect of this narrow focus on RCTs. Sometimes donors are unwilling to fund non-experimental evaluations. Even the World Bank is responding, having been criticized for a long time for not doing enough social experiments in their lending operations. And I guess one of the largest trust funds that the bank has had has been focused primarily on randomized controlled trials. So I think there are these crowding out effects that we need to be particularly sensitive to in the context of moving the evaluation frontier out. The second set of issues here relate to implementation. And in a sense that's implied in the other things that Angus also mentioned. Questions such as, do programs work well when they are implemented by a weak bureaucracy or a conflicted bureaucracy rather than university-trained researchers? I think that's a very important question that we have to think about, and I'll come back to that in a second. Issues of scale. Who will be responsible for kind of implementing a program that seems to have had an RCT that's showing us good results? What are the incentives to perform? So I'm thinking of the institutional sort of envelope around the kind of policies that RCTs may show seem to have good results in small-scale experiments. But then if we don't understand why they work, and it goes to the larger question of why they work, if we don't understand the issues of incentives, if we don't understand the issues of accountability, if we don't understand the issues of voice, if we don't understand the issues of management, these things then make it very difficult to think about how these kinds of programs, when they're taken to scale, will be implemented. So I think there are these large number of, there's also a question of entry point. As Angus has emphasized, we know what happens, but we don't know why it happens. And if you don't know why it happens, typically you don't have a good idea of the entry point for that particular policy. And in many ways, politics and the choice of good policies and programs is a question of finding the right entry point that is going to, at various points in time, have enough political support that you'll be able to sustain that kind of a policy. So I think there are these implementation and design issues that also come back to us. Let me end with just this sense, which